"You're tired, Mom. Let us handle everything." That's what my daughter-in-law said, smiling while pouring me a glass of champagne. I thought she cared. I thought my son did too. They said the trip was to celebrate my recovery after surgery. I wanted to believe that. But when she stood behind me on that yacht, whispering the same words again, I finally understood what she meant. A few hours later, they told everyone I'd fallen by accident. They took my house, my company, and my name. They thought I wouldn't come back. But they were wrong. That night, when they walked through the door, I was already sitting in her chair waiting. I didn't need anger or revenge, just the truth. If you've ever trusted someone who used that trust to hurt you, stay with me. This story isn't just mine. Say hi to the waves, Mom. That is what my daughter-in-law said to me just before I felt her hand on my back and the world disappeared beneath my feet. I didn't even have time to understand what was happening. One moment I was standing at the edge of the deck, listening to the sound of the water and the wind, and the next I was falling, my body twisting toward the ocean, the air leaving my chest before the water even touched me. The shock of the cold hit so hard that for a second I could not tell if I was still alive. When I forced my eyes open, I saw the boat above me and, on the deck, my son Andrew standing beside her. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't running, he was just watching. That stillness in his face, the way he didn't even lean forward, told me more than words ever could. My name is Evelyn Hartman. I am 67 years old, and until that moment I still believed that being a mother meant something that couldn't be erased. For 40 years I was married to Richard, who built Hartman Vineyards with me. We worked side by side, raised our son, and tried to create something that would outlast us. When Richard died, everything changed. Andrew inherited the company and his wife, Lauren, became the one managing all the details of our lives. She told me I had worked too hard and should rest, that I didn't need to worry about the business, that they would take care of everything. I believed her because I wanted to believe that someone in this family still cared about me. 6 weeks before that day, I had surgery on my hip, and recovery was slow. Lauren visited almost every day, bringing food, handling bills, and telling me what to sign. She said the documents were just temporary arrangements while I healed, that they would help her manage things more efficiently. I didn't ask questions, partly because I was tired and partly because I trusted her. She was part of the family. She called me Mom. When they invited me for a short cruise to celebrate my recovery, I said yes without hesitation. It had been months since we'd done anything together, and I thought maybe this was their way of reconnecting. That morning, I dressed carefully, wanting to look like myself again, not just a patient who needed help walking. Andrew greeted me at the marina with a warm smile, and for a few hours everything seemed almost normal. We drank champagne, talked about old times, and I let myself believe that we were still a family. But as the day went on, the tone changed. Andrew began asking questions about my will, about whether I had made it easier for them to manage things if something ever happened to me. He said probate was complicated, that it might take months to sort out. I told him we could talk about it another time, but he pressed, saying, "We just want to make sure everything's taken care of." Lauren stood beside him, nodding, her phone in her hand as if she were taking pictures, but I noticed the way the camera was angled. Toward me, how it stayed fixed even when she wasn't smiling. That was when I first felt uneasy, though I didn't yet know why. The conversation ended awkwardly, and for a few minutes we stood in silence while the yacht drifted in calm water. Then Andrew pulled a folder from his bag and said he needed me to sign one last document. He told me it was just another authorization, nothing serious, and when I hesitated, he smiled like he used to when he wanted me to agree. I told him no, that I wanted to go back to shore, that I didn't feel comfortable. His smile faded. He said, "Mom, you've been confused lately." And Lauren added quietly, "You're tired, Mom. Let us handle everything." Those words sounded almost caring, but there was something in her tone that made me step back. Before I could respond, she moved behind me, still smiling. I remember thinking that maybe I was wrong. Maybe she just wanted to steady me because of my hip, and then I felt the push. Not hard, not sudden, just firm enough to take away my balance. The water hit me like a wall. My dress pulled me down, and for a moment I couldn't tell which way was up. I managed to break the surface, gasping for air, shouting their names, but the sound of the engine drowned everything. The yacht was already turning, moving away faster than I could swim. I saw Andrew's shape one last time. He leaned over the rail, still watching. I raised my hand, but he didn't move. Then they were gone. The cold was unbearable, and every breath felt like it might be my last. My hip burned with pain, and I wondered if this was how it ended. Quiet, slow, out in the open water where no one would ever find me. But then something inside me shifted. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was instinct, maybe it was just the simple thought that I wasn't finished yet. I kicked off my shoes, tried to float, and forced myself to keep my head above the surface. The boat disappeared completely, and all that was left was the sound of the waves and the realization that my own family had done this to me. I don't know how long I fought the current before I stopped trying to understand why. All I knew was that I had to stay alive long enough to see their faces again, to look them in the eye and let them know I knew everything. The sky was bright, the water endless, and the pain in my hip constant, but I kept moving because stopping would have meant giving them exactly what they wanted. They thought it was over. They thought I would vanish quietly and make their lives easier. But they were wrong. Because even then, in the middle of that cold water, I knew I wasn't just fighting to live. I was fighting to make sure they'd never be able to pretend I didn't exist. That morning, the sky over Savannah was bright and warm, the kind of light that makes you think the world still has good in it. I had just finished my tea when the phone rang, and I saw Andrew's name on the screen. It surprised me because lately, he only called through his assistant or sent short messages that never sounded like him. But that day, he spoke softly, almost the way he used to. He said, "Mom, we want to take you out on the yacht, just the three of us, to celebrate your recovery. You've been through a lot, and we thought it would be nice to do something as a family, like we used to." Hearing him say that made something inside me loosen. Since Richard passed 2 years ago, Andrew had been distant, busy, and always tired. I told myself it was grief, that people change when they lose a father, that maybe it was my fault for clinging too tightly. So when he invited me, I said yes right away. I wanted to believe that maybe the distance between us was finally closing. I remember standing in front of my closet longer than usual that morning. I wanted to wear something that reminded me of better times, so I chose the navy blue dress Richard used to love, the one he said made me look strong. I put on a small pair of pearl earrings he had given me for our anniversary and tried not to think about how quiet the house had become since his death. When the taxi arrived, I locked the door and told myself I'd come home later that evening, with something to smile about. The marina was quiet, except for the sound of the gulls and the water slapping against the boats. Lauren was already there, standing on the dock, her sunglasses hiding most of her face. She waved, her smile bright and confident, the kind of smile that photographs well. She hugged me lightly and said how wonderful I looked, how happy she was that I was strong enough to come. Her tone was cheerful, but something about it felt rehearsed, like a line she had practiced. Andrew came a moment later, dressed in white like he always did for these occasions, and he kissed my cheek. "Doesn't she look great?" he said to Lauren, and she nodded, saying, "You're glowing, Mom. You really are." The yacht was spotless, shining in the sun, much larger than I expected. The name, the Silver Wing, was written across the side in silver letters. It looked expensive, more expensive than anything they should have been able to afford. Andrew mentioned that they bought it last year. A business investment, he called it, though he never explained what business that was. Lauren offered me a glass of champagne and said, "To new beginnings." I took it because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. For the first hour, it almost felt real. The air was calm, the ocean gentle, and we talked about small things, the vineyard, the weather, how quiet the house had become. I told Andrew I missed him, and he smiled, saying, "You don't need to worry about anything anymore, Mom. We're taking care of everything now." He said it in a way that sounded kind, but also final. Lauren sat across from me, scrolling through her phone, pretending to take selfies. Every few minutes, she'd tilt it slightly, and I'd catch my own reflection in the screen, the camera always angled toward me. At one point, she said, "Smile, Mom. You look so serious." And I laughed awkwardly, trying not to feel uncomfortable. She recorded me drinking, talking, and answering Andrew's questions. At the time, I thought it was harmless, just her way of documenting the day. But now I understand she was collecting pieces of evidence, creating the version of me they wanted the world to see. The conversation shifted when Andrew started asking about the trust. "Have you thought about simplifying things, Mom? It might make things easier for everyone later." His tone was light, but his words were careful. He mentioned how complicated probate could be, how lawyers could tie things up for years. I remember laughing and saying, "I'm not going anywhere, Andrew. We have time." But Lauren quickly added, "It's always better to be prepared, right?" and gave him a look I didn't recognize at the time. After a while, Andrew stood up and walked toward the cabin. He came back with a manila folder and set it on the table. "We can talk about this later," he said, "but it's just something we should all agree on." I didn't open it. I told him I wanted to enjoy the day, not talk about papers. Lauren leaned over and placed her hand on mine, her smile never changing, and said softly, "Of course, Mom. You've been through enough. Just relax. We'll handle everything." That sentence stayed with me longer than I realized. We'll handle everything. It sounded like kindness, but it felt like the end of something. The sun was high by then, and the water looked peaceful, stretching endlessly in every direction. I remember thinking that it was strange how quiet the world seemed when you were that far from shore. No voices, no traffic, just the steady hum of the engine and the faint sound of the wind. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to let myself believe this was real. That maybe, for a day, I could be part of their lives again. But when I opened them, I saw Lauren still holding her phone, still recording, and Andrew standing behind her, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Something in my stomach turned, but I pushed the feeling aside. I didn't want to believe my own son could mean me harm. Looking back now, I think the whole day was planned. The invitation, the smiles, the champagne, all of it designed to make me comfortable, to make me let my guard down, to make me trust them completely before they took everything. At the time, though, I didn't see any of that. I was just a mother trying to feel close to her son again. I wanted it so badly that I ignored every warning sign, and by the time I realized what was really happening, I was already standing on the edge of the deck, the waves below me calm and endless, and Lauren was already behind me. The sky began to change not long after we left the coast. The sun that had made everything shine just an hour before was now hidden behind heavy clouds, and the air turned sharp and gray. Lauren went inside the cabin and came back with a folder in her hands, the same one Andrew had shown me earlier. She placed it on the small table between us and said in that calm, practiced tone of hers, "It's just a temporary authorization, Mom. Nothing complicated. You just need to sign it, and everything will be easier for all of us." I looked at the folder, then at her face, and I felt a kind of stillness I can't describe, the kind that comes when you suddenly understand that something is very wrong. I put my glass down slowly and said, "I'm not signing anything, Lauren. Not anymore." For a few seconds, no one moved. The air felt thick, like the moment before a storm. Andrew looked at her, and then he looked at me. He gave a small nod, and when he spoke, his voice was nothing like the voice of the boy I had raised. "Mom," he said quietly, "Dr. Wallace told us your memory has been slipping. You forget things. You get confused. We've been trying to help, but it's getting worse." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My hands were shaking, but not because I was confused. I stood up, my legs unsteady from the surgery, and said, "That's a lie. You know exactly what you're doing." Lauren's smile disappeared, and what came next was something I will never forget. She stepped closer, her heels clicking on the deck, her face calm and cold. "Everyone already knows you've been having problems," she said softly. "When they hear what happened, it will all make sense. An older woman recovering from surgery probably took the wrong medication, got dizzy, fell overboard. Tragic, but believable." Andrew didn't say a word. He just stared at the ocean, his hands gripping the railing, his face pale. For a brief moment, I thought maybe he would stop her, that the son I raised would come back to himself and tell her this had gone far enough. But he didn't. He just stood there, frozen, as if this was something that had already been decided long ago. I took a step back, trying to keep distance between us, but the deck was narrow and my hip was still weak. Lauren's hand rested lightly on my arm as if she wanted to steady me, and she whispered, "It's better this way, Mom. You'll rest, and we'll take care of everything." Her tone was calm, almost tender, and that made it worse. I said her name, but my voice broke halfway through. "Lauren, don't do this." She looked at me without blinking. "I already did." I turned toward Andrew again, hoping for something, a sign of hesitation, a word, anything. But he didn't meet my eyes. He just said quietly, "Please, Mom, don't make this harder." That was the moment I stopped believing that family meant anything. I had given him everything. His education, his home, his business, his freedom, and now he was letting someone else decide whether I deserved to live. Lauren reached behind me, her voice still soft, almost a whisper, and she said, "Say hi to the waves, Mom." The push wasn't sudden or violent, it was careful, deliberate, just strong enough to take away my balance. My hands reached for the railing, but my fingers slipped on the polished metal, and then the deck disappeared beneath me. The last thing I saw before the water hit my face was Andrew's expression. No anger, no sorrow, no fear, just silence. The fall itself felt endless, though it must have taken only a second. The sound of the water filled my ears before I could even scream, and then everything was cold and heavy. I tried to kick, but the weight of my clothes pulled me down. When I finally broke the surface, gasping for air, I saw the yacht already moving away, the engine louder than the wind. I shouted his name once, twice, but he didn't look back. Lauren stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm as if to comfort him. I don't know if she said something to him, but I saw her head tilt toward him, calm and composed, as though this was just another step in their plan. The rain started not long after, soft at first, then harder. The sea around me turned darker with every second. My arms felt heavy, my body weak, but I forced myself to stay above the surface. The waves came higher, splashing over my face, blurring everything. I couldn't see the shore anymore. I didn't even know which direction it was. In that moment, I thought about all the times I had told Andrew to be brave, to fight for what was right, to never turn away from someone who needed help. I wondered what he would tell his son if he ever had one. Maybe nothing. Maybe he'd say the same thing his wife had just said to me, that it was better this way. The yacht grew smaller until it was only a white shape against the dark sky, and then it was gone. The sound of the engine faded, and all that was left was the sea and the beating of my heart. I floated there, half praying, half cursing, realizing that the people I loved most had decided my life was over. But as the water closed in around me and the cold pressed deeper into my bones, another thought came. Quiet but clear. They had planned everything except for this. They didn't know I would survive. When I woke up, the first thing I smelled was salt and old motor oil. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of sea and cigarettes, and I could feel the steady hum of an engine beneath me. I opened my eyes slowly, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or how I got there. Then it came back in pieces, the cold water, the sound of the yacht's engine fading away, Andrew's face looking down at me before everything went dark. A man was sitting beside me, his hands rough and his clothes worn from work. His skin was darkened by years under the sun, and his eyes had that tired kindness you see in people who have seen too much. "You're awake," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady. "You were lucky. I saw you go overboard, maybe half a mile away. I thought it was debris at first, but then I saw you moving." His name was Frank Delaney, the captain of a small fishing boat called Morning Tide. He told me later that he'd been out checking his nets when he saw a shape in the water. "Brought you in as fast as I could," he said, handing me a cup of coffee that smelled burnt but warm. "Didn't think you'd make it, to be honest." I tried to sit up, but my body protested with pain. My hip felt like it was on fire, and every breath came out in a shiver. Frank noticed and pulled a thick blanket around me. "Take it slow," he said, and then he sat back down, lighting a cigarette even though the wind kept trying to blow it out. For a while, we didn't speak. I just stared at the floorboards, soaked and trembling, while he watched the horizon like someone who knew better than to ask too many questions. Finally, he said, "You want to tell me what happened?" I hesitated. The words felt heavy, almost embarrassing, like admitting that the people I loved most had tried to kill me. "My son and his wife," I said quietly. "They pushed me off their yacht. They wanted me gone." Frank didn't flinch. He just nodded once, took a drag from his cigarette and said, "Figured it wasn't an accident. Nobody looks like that after a fall." His tone wasn't cruel, just matter of fact, the way someone might talk about bad weather or a broken engine. After a moment, he said something I'll never forget. "My wife died because our son said it was for her own good. He took her out of the hospital early to make her comfortable, and she never made it through the night. That was 5 years ago. Since then, I've learned to tell when someone's lying about doing the right thing." He looked at me, and I could tell that whatever pain he carried had never really gone away. "I'm not letting that happen again," he said quietly. I didn't know what to say, so I just whispered, "I need to disappear." He nodded as if he already expected that answer. "Then you didn't meet me, understand?" By the time we reached shore, it was dark. The lights along the harbor flickered weakly in the mist, and the air smelled of seaweed and diesel. Frank's grandson, a thin boy named Tyler who couldn't have been older than 16, helped him tie the boat and carried my small bag without being asked. He didn't ask who I was or where I came from. He just looked worried, like he understood more than he should. Frank led me up a narrow path toward a small inn that looked older than both of us put together. The sign said Nora's Harbor Inn, its paint faded and its edges chipped from the salt wind. He knocked on the door twice, and a woman in her late 60s opened it. She was short, with silver hair tied in a bun, and the kind of face that could look kind or dangerous depending on how you treated her. "This is Nora," Frank said. "She runs this place. She owes me a favor." Nora looked me up and down without judgment, just quiet observation. "You look like hell," she said finally, but her voice wasn't unkind. "Get inside before you catch your death." The warmth of the inn hit me like another wave. It smelled of coffee, baked bread, and the faint sweetness of something fried in butter. Nora handed me a towel and pointed toward the stove. "Sit down. You want soup or tea?" I said tea, though my voice barely came out. She disappeared into the kitchen and came back with a steaming mug and a small plate of crackers. When I thanked her, she just shrugged. "You don't owe me thanks. People who show up half-drowned usually don't do it for fun." After I ate a little, she sat across from me and asked, "You running from something? Or someone?" I hesitated. Lying felt useless. "Someone," I said. "Two someones, actually." She nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something she already knew. "Everyone who ends up here is running from something," she said. "The only question is whether you're running to live or running to get even." I looked at her for a moment, feeling the weight of what she was really asking. Then I said quietly, "Both." Nora didn't seem surprised. She just got up and said, "Then you'll need a room in the back. Less chance of being seen from the road." That night, lying in a bed that smelled faintly of salt and detergent, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of waves hitting the rocks outside. My body ached from exhaustion, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the yacht, the way it drifted away, the way Andrew's face looked when he didn't reach for me. I was alive, but it didn't feel like living. It felt like waking up in a world where everything I thought was true had been taken apart and rearranged into something cruel and unrecognizable. Somewhere outside, a foghorn sounded low and distant, and for the first time since the fall, I took a deep breath and said out loud, "They think I'm gone." The sound of my own voice startled me, but it also gave me a strange kind of strength. I wasn't gone. Not yet. And as I listened to the waves outside Nora's inn, I realized that being alive might be the only weapon I had left. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and something warm baking in the kitchen. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. The bed was soft, the sound of the waves outside steady, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and salt. Then I heard Nora's footsteps and her voice saying my name from the doorway. "You might want to see this," she said, holding out a folded newspaper. Her tone was quiet, careful, the way people speak when they're not sure how much truth a person can take in one moment. She set the paper in front of me, and I saw the headline before I even touched it. "Evelyn Hartman, CEO of Hartman Vineyards, dies in yacht accident off the coast of Massachusetts." My name, printed in black ink above a smiling photo of me and Andrew, taken at a company event last year. I stared at it so long that the letters started to blur. For a second, it didn't even feel like it was about me. It felt like I was reading a story about some other woman who happened to share my name and my face. I finally picked up the paper. The article described how I had fallen into the water during a family outing, how Andrew and his wife had tried desperately to save me, and how authorities confirmed no foul play was suspected. It said I had been showing signs of early memory loss, that I'd become increasingly forgetful, and that I'd recently stepped back from managing the family business for health reasons. At the bottom of the page, there was a quote from Lauren. "My mother-in-law hadn't been well for some time. We're heartbroken but relieved that she's at peace now." Next to her statement was a photograph of her standing in front of our vineyard, crying, her face turned toward the cameras. She looked the part perfectly, grieving, fragile, loving. Watching her play the role of the devoted daughter-in-law on television later that morning, I could almost admire her performance if it hadn't been built on the destruction of my life. Nora watched me as I read, her hands resting on the back of the chair. "You okay?" she asked gently. I didn't answer right away. My hands were trembling and I could feel something hot building behind my eyes. "They said I had Alzheimer's," I finally whispered. "They said I forgot things, that I wasn't capable of running my own life." Nora shook her head slowly. "People will say anything if it makes their story cleaner." I read the rest of the article even though it hurt. The final paragraph said donations could be made to the Alzheimer Foundation in memory of Evelyn Hartman. I stared at that line for a long time before I started to laugh, the sound sharp and uneven. "They're making money off my death," I said, half laughing, half crying. "They couldn't stop stealing from me while I was alive, so they found a way to keep doing it after I was gone." Nora didn't laugh. She just poured me another cup of coffee and said, "Then it's a good thing you're not gone." A few hours later, the phone at the front desk rang. Nora answered, listened for a while, then covered the receiver and whispered, "Someone asking for you by name. Said they wanted to offer condolences." My stomach twisted. Who? I asked. Didn't say. Just a friend. I told her to say she had the wrong number. When Nora hung up, I sat there for a long time, thinking about how quickly news travels when money is involved. If a stranger was calling this place already, it meant Andrew and Lauren had wasted no time spreading the story. I could almost hear them, sitting in my house, telling people how tragic it all was, how they were coping as best they could. That evening, Nora turned on the small television she kept behind the counter. We were halfway through the local news when I saw them again, Andrew and Lauren, standing side by side, dressed in black, giving a statement to reporters outside the vineyard gates. Lauren's eyes were red, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. She said, "My mother-in-law was a wonderful woman. We miss her terribly. It's been a very difficult time for our family." Next to her stood Andrew, his arm around her shoulder, looking exactly how a grieving son should look. Calm, heartbroken, composed. I stared at the screen, waiting for some sign of guilt, but there was nothing. He looked like a man at peace with the world, as if burying his mother had somehow made his life simpler. But the person who caught my attention wasn't either of them. Standing just behind them, half in frame, was a woman I recognized, tall, with carefully styled hair and a pearl necklace that looked too expensive for casual wear. It took me a second to remember where I'd seen her before. Her name was Victoria Langford. She was a lawyer, sharp, ambitious, and very selective about her clients. I had met her once at a charity dinner a few years earlier. She talked about her firm, Langford and Gray Consulting Group, and how they specialized in complex estate transitions. My chest tightened as I watched her on the screen. She wasn't there by accident. Victoria Langford didn't show up to comfort grieving families. She showed up when there was money to be moved, assets to be secured, and documents to be rewritten. After the broadcast ended, I couldn't sit still. I asked Nora if I could use her old laptop, the one she kept for bookkeeping. It was slow and covered in stickers, but it worked. I searched for Langford and Gray Consulting Group, and the first thing that came up was a tagline under their logo: "Managing high-risk family estates with discretion and compassion." I clicked through page after page until I found articles mentioning their clients, all wealthy, all elderly, all recently deceased. The more I read, the clearer it became. Langford didn't just handle estate planning, she handled families who wanted to speed the process along. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The press, the lawyers, the donations, every piece of it had been arranged. I wasn't just the victim of a family's greed. I was part of a business plan. Nora came over quietly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You find what you needed?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "They're not just stealing from me. They're managing it. They're making it official." For a long time we didn't speak. The room was filled with the sound of waves outside and the hum of the old refrigerator. Then Nora said softly, "So, what are you going to do?" I looked at her, the words forming in my throat before I even realized I was saying them. "They think I'm gone," I said. "But if they've already started dividing what's mine, that means I still have time to stop them." A few days passed before Frank came to me with an idea. I was sitting in the small dining room of Nora's Inn, staring at the newspaper for the 10th time, when he walked in with his usual quiet confidence. He put his cap on the table and said, "I know someone who might be able to help you." When I asked who, he hesitated for a second, as if deciding whether to risk it. "An old friend of my wife's," he said finally. "Name's Caleb Monroe. Used to work for the FBI before he got tired of the politics. Now he does private investigations. If anyone can make sense of what your son and his wife pulled, it's him." That afternoon, Frank made a call from the payphone outside, speaking in short sentences, giving no details. Later that evening, a car pulled up outside the inn, and a tall man in his 50s stepped out. His hair was gray at the sides, and his suit looked like it had seen too many stakeouts. When he came in, he introduced himself simply, "Caleb Monroe." His handshake was firm, and his eyes studied me with a kind of patience that only comes from someone who's seen too much and stopped pretending to be surprised. We sat around one of Nora's small wooden tables, the smell of coffee and sea air mixing in the room. I told him everything, from the invitation to the yacht, to the push, to the newspaper obituary, and the lawyer I'd seen standing behind Andrew. He didn't interrupt, didn't take notes, just listened. When I finished, he sat quietly for a long time, tapping a finger against his cup. Then he said, "If they think you're dead, that's not a curse. That's a gift. The dead can go anywhere, see anything, and nobody asks questions. I couldn't help but smile at the bluntness of it. And do anything, I added. He nodded slightly. That too. We started laying out a plan. Caleb spoke in the calm, methodical way of someone who'd spent years breaking down cases into pieces. First, he said, no one can know you're alive. That includes the police, any old friends, or anyone who might accidentally mention your name. You're gone, and you need to stay gone until we understand who's really behind this. He looked at me. Second, we gather evidence. Not stories, not feelings, evidence. We find out how they planned this, who helped them, and how much of your estate has already been moved. Frank added, and third, we go after that lawyer, Langford. She's the spider in the middle of this web. Caleb agreed. Langford's firm handles high-value inheritance transitions. If your family's working with her, that means it's bigger than just greed. It's organized. The room was quiet for a while after that. Outside, the wind had picked up and the sound of the waves was louder now, almost like a drumbeat against the rocks. Nora came by and poured more coffee without asking. She didn't say anything, but her eyes stayed on me for a moment, as if she could see how much I was trying to keep my composure. Caleb unfolded a map of the area, spreading it across the table. He pointed to the marina, to the vineyard, to the main road that led back to Boston. They think you're at the bottom of the ocean, he said, so they'll move quickly. People don't wait to clean up after a tragedy when there's money involved. We need to know what's being signed, where it's going, and who's doing it for them. I watched him speak and realized how strange it felt to sit in that small, dimly lit room and talk about my own life as if it were a case file. Just a few weeks earlier, I had been recovering from surgery, hoping my son would visit more often, telling myself we could be close again. Now, I was planning how to expose him. The thought made me dizzy, but there was also a quiet relief in it. At least now, I wasn't powerless. Frank leaned back in his chair and said, "You need to decide what you want out of this, Evelyn. Are you after justice, or are you after revenge?" His voice wasn't accusing, just honest. I looked down at my hands. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. "I don't know anymore," I said finally. "Maybe both." Caleb nodded like he'd heard that answer before. "Then we'll aim for truth. It's cleaner. Truth has a way of handling the rest." We worked for hours that night. Caleb outlined what we'd need, a way to track communications, a look at financial transfers, and proof that Langford was involved in something illegal. Frank said he could stay near the docks and keep an eye on the boats that came and went. He knew the local fishermen, the harbor patrol, even the Coast Guard officers who rotated night shifts. Nora, who had been listening from the counter, said she could handle the phones. "If anyone calls looking for an Evelyn Hartman," she said, "they'll be told she drowned." At one point, Caleb looked at me and asked, "Do you have any records that weren't managed by your son? Old copies, bank documents, anything like that?" I thought about it and remembered the safe deposit box Richard and I had opened years ago. It was under my maiden name, something Andrew didn't know. "There's cash and documents there," I said. "Enough to keep us going for a while." Caleb smiled faintly. "Good. Money gives us time. Time gives us choices." By the time we finished, it was late. The inn was quiet except for the wind outside, and the coffee had gone cold. We sat for a moment without speaking, the weight of what we had just agreed to settling in. It felt strange to be surrounded by people I had met barely a week ago and still feel safer than I ever had with my own family. When Caleb left, he said he'd start looking into Langford's firm first. "If she's involved, she'll have left a trail," he said. "People like her always do." Frank promised to check the marina at dawn. "Don't worry," he said. "If anyone starts asking questions, they'll have to get through me first." After they were gone, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the empty cups and the map. The room smelled like salt and burnt coffee. I took out a small notebook from my bag, the one I had kept since the hospital, and started writing. Not notes for Caleb or anyone else, just for me. I wrote the date and then the words, "The Second Life Project." It wasn't a title. It was a promise. That if I had been given another chance to live, I would use it to make every one of them see what they'd done. It was almost midnight when I finally made my way back to the Hartman estate. The streets were empty, and the night air was cool enough to sting my skin. I hadn't been there since before the accident, and as the gate came into view, something inside me tightened. The house looked exactly the same brick walls, the same tall windows, the same perfect lawn, but standing there, I realized how completely it no longer belonged to me. The place that once felt like home now looked like a stranger wearing a familiar face. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance. The lights were on inside, glowing faintly through the curtains. I remembered leaving those lights on for Andrew when he was a boy, waiting for him to come home after football practice. Now, the light didn't mean safety anymore. It meant someone else lived my life. The side gate was still loose. Andrew had always meant to fix it and never did, so I slipped through easily and moved across the garden. The smell of fresh paint and new flowers mixed with something that didn't belong. Lauren's perfume. I could recognize it anywhere. That expensive floral scent she always wore. The one she said made her feel untouchable. It was everywhere. On the curtains, on the air, as if she'd erased me by covering every trace with herself. Inside, the house was spotless. Too spotless. Not a single thing out of place. My photographs were gone, replaced with new ones. Andrew and Lauren smiling at events, posing in front of the vineyard, even one where they stood together holding a small white box. I stared at that one for a long time before I moved on. I made my way to Richard's old study. The door creaked slightly when I pushed it open, and the familiar smell of leather and old books filled the air. My husband had spent half his life in that room, surrounded by files and contracts and plans for the vineyard. It had always been his space, and later it became mine. Now it belonged to them. The desk was covered in documents. At first glance, it looked like business paperwork, tax forms, reports, bank statements, but one folder stood out. It was labeled in neat, typed letters, Project Evelyn. I froze. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside were pages and pages of records, medical forms, doctor's notes, test results, all written in language that suggested I was losing my mind. Patient displays confusion during routine visits. Recommended assisted decision-making. Decline in cognitive performance. All signed, all stamped. None of it real. Under the papers was a flash drive. I plugged it into the small laptop on the desk and opened the folder. There were videos, short clips labeled by date. The first showed me sitting at my dining table looking confused as I tried to remember which pill to take. I remembered that day. I just had my pain medication changed, and Lauren had been filming for safety. She said. In the video, she was behind the camera saying softly, "See? You mixed them again, Mom. You really need us to help you with this." Another clip showed me at a dinner party, talking slowly, forgetting a name. In the background, Lauren's voice again, cheerful and sympathetic, narrating like she was documenting evidence. There were even audio recordings, small, edited conversations pieced together to make it sound like I didn't recognize my own son. It wasn't just a plan, it was a performance, one they had been building for months, maybe longer. Every mistake, every hesitation, every confused look had been turned into proof. And then I saw it. A memo at the bottom of the stack, signed with the initials VL, Victoria Langford. The letterhead was from Langford and Gray Consulting. It outlined Phase 3, transfer of assets upon medical confirmation of incompetency. The words blurred as I read them. I could barely breathe. I took out my phone and began taking photos of everything. The documents, the screen, the signatures. My hands trembling so hard that some of the pictures came out blurry. I didn't care. I just needed something, anything, to prove this was real. Then I heard it, a car door slamming outside. Headlights flashed across the curtains. My heart started pounding. They were back. I gathered the papers as quickly as I could, putting everything back exactly as I'd found it, and slipped toward the back door. My hip ached with every step, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I moved through the kitchen, careful not to touch anything, and stepped into the garden just as the front door opened. From the shadows I could hear voices, Andrew's low and tired, Lauren's sharper, complaining about something. I held my breath waiting for them to move farther inside. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, came a sound that didn't fit. Soft at first, then clearer. A baby crying. I froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The high, uneven wail of a newborn. My first thought was that I was imagining it, but the sound came again, longer this time, coming from upstairs. I stared toward the lighted windows, my mind trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Lauren wasn't pregnant. I had seen her just days before the yacht trip. Perfect, slim, confident, not someone who had just given birth. My throat tightened as I whispered to myself, "That's impossible." But deep down, I already knew. In their world, nothing was impossible anymore. The next morning, I went back. I told Frank and Caleb I just needed to see something for myself. though I think they already knew I wouldn't be talked out of it. I parked far from the house near the old oak trees by the corner of the property and made my way through the side yard until I could see the living room through one of the windows. The curtains were partly drawn, just enough for me to look in without being seen. Inside, the house looked warm, bright, and impossibly peaceful. Lauren was sitting on the couch holding a baby, a boy, maybe 3 weeks old. He was wrapped in a soft blue blanket, his tiny hand clutching her finger. She smiled down at him, the kind of smile people practice for photographs. I heard her voice through the open window. "Noah," she said softly, "Mommy's here." Noah. The word hit me harder than I expected. The baby's name was Noah. The house that once carried the sound of Andrew's laughter now carried the sound of another child, one I'd never known existed. The rooms were filled with baby things, a crib in the corner, toys still in their boxes, a framed photo of Lauren and Andrew with the baby in their arms, as if they were a perfect family, untouched by guilt or blood. For a moment I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring through the glass, my chest tightening with every breath. It was like looking at a version of my life where I had been completely erased. Every picture, every sound, every piece of that house said the same thing. Evelyn never existed. And then came the ache. A deep, physical ache that had nothing to do with my hip or my age. It was the same ache I had felt 35 years ago when I held Andrew for the first time in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and hope. I remembered the way he'd fit in my arms, the weight of him, the small, fragile warmth of a new life. I remembered whispering to him, "I'll always protect you, no matter what happens." Back then, I believed it. Back then, I didn't know that one day the child I had promised to protect would be the one I needed protection from. I stayed there longer than I should have, watching Lauren move around the room with the baby. She looked relaxed, humming softly as she adjusted the blanket and rocked him back to sleep. I tried to see any sign of guilt in her face, some flicker of conscience, but there was nothing, only calm, practiced affection. Later that day, when I returned to Nora's inn, Caleb was already there, waiting with his laptop open. He looked up when I walked in. "We found something," he said. He turned the screen toward me. It was a birth certificate. Noah Whitlock, born 3 weeks ago at Helix Fertility Institute. Mother, Lauren Whitlock. Father, Andrew Whitlock. Everything looked official. Signatures, hospital stamps, the works. But Caleb's face told me there was more. "Here's the problem," he said. "According to hospital records, Lauren was never admitted there. No check-ins, no prenatal appointments, no discharge forms. Nothing." I frowned. "Then how—" He clicked another file. There was a patient admitted under a different name. Lily Harper. 17 years old. No insurance, no family listed. She delivered a male infant 3 weeks ago. Cause of death, postpartum complications. Frank, who had been standing quietly in the corner, swore under his breath. "Complications, my ass." Caleb continued, his tone measured but heavy. "The timelines match exactly. The day Lily Harper died is the same day the birth certificate for Noah Whitlock was filed. And the signatures on the medical documents? They were notarized by a legal associate from Langford and Gray." For a while, none of us said anything. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the wall clock. Frank broke the silence first. He leaned forward, his voice low. "They didn't just steal your money, Evelyn. They bought a baby." I looked at him, but I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Finally, I whispered, "No, they didn't buy a baby. They bought a life." The weight of it hit me all at once. A 17-year-old girl, alone and desperate, promised money or safety, maybe told she was helping a kind couple who couldn't have children. And then, silence. No questions, no investigation, just a line on a report that said complications. Lauren had built an entire story around that baby. The perfect family, the grieving son, the loving mother gone too soon. It wasn't just deception, it was replacement. She had taken everything that had been mine, my family, my home, even my role as mother, and filled it with herself. I felt tears running down my face before I realized I was crying. Frank reached across the table and took my hand, his grip steady and warm. "We'll make this right," he said. "We'll find proof." Caleb nodded. "We already have a trail. Langford's firm handled the paperwork. That means there are financial records somewhere, payments, transfers, medical authorizations. If we can connect those dots, we can expose them." but I barely heard him. My eyes were fixed on the photo on his screen, the hospital's patient record. Lily Harper, age 17, deceased. The word deceased looked so clean, so official, as if a young girl's life could be summed up in one tidy sentence. That night, I stood by the window in my room at Nora's Inn and looked out toward the ocean. The waves were black under the moonlight, rising and falling like they carried secrets. Somewhere across that same ocean, my son and his wife were sleeping soundly beside a child who wasn't theirs, a child born from someone else's pain. And for the first time since I'd crawled out of that water, I felt something new. Not anger, not fear, but purpose. The sound of the baby's cry from the night, before echoed in my mind, soft at first, then louder, until it felt like it was right outside the window. I closed my eyes and whispered to the dark, "That cry isn't his curse, it's mine, and I'm not done yet." Caleb spent the next few days digging deeper. He worked quietly, methodically, the way only someone trained to see patterns in chaos can. Most of the time, he said very little, just stared at the screen or scribbled notes into his small leather notebook. Every so often, he'd mutter something under his breath, a name, a date, a company, connecting dots that the rest of us couldn't see yet. One evening, he called Frank and me into the small dining room at Nora's Inn. The table was covered with papers, printouts, and photographs. It looked like the aftermath of a storm, except this storm had names, bank accounts, and signatures. Caleb stood with his hands on the back of a chair and said, "I think I've figured out what we're dealing with." He pointed to a chart he'd drawn, a web of names and arrows leading back to one central figure, Victoria Langford. Langford and her husband Samuel run something they call the Langford Group for Humane Estate Transitions. That's the official name. But what it really is a network, a very profitable one, built on a single idea, inheritance through control. He handed me a sheet of paper. Across the top it read, Compassionate Inheritance Program. Underneath was a mission statement, helping families manage the emotional and financial burden of elderly decline with grace and efficiency. Caleb's voice hardened. They call it compassionate inheritance. What it means in practice is this. Wealthy families with aging parents go to Langford and Gray. The firm provides them with legal strategies to assume guardianship, claim mental incompetence, and take control of all assets before death. They make it sound merciful, efficient, humane, but in reality it's exploitation dressed as kindness. Frank leaned back, arms crossed. And when the parents don't play along? Caleb met his eyes. Then they have accidents. The room went quiet. Even Nora, who'd been washing dishes behind the counter, stopped moving for a second. He continued, flipping through the documents. They use the same playbook every time. Medical manipulation, sedatives, falsified memory tests, coaching doctors to record confusion, financial isolation, changing advisors, blocking access to accounts. Then, once the groundwork is done, the target either signs over control or conveniently dies. Boating accidents, falls, car crashes, medication errors, always tragic, always believable. I felt cold, even though the heater was running. "How many?" I asked. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. Caleb looked at the paper in his hand, then at me. "So far, I've confirmed 23. You would have been 24. I stared at the table, at the neat lines connecting one name to another, sons, daughters, lawyers, doctors, all part of the same machine. Each line represented a family that had traded love for money, conscience for comfort. I thought about all the times I told Andrew that success meant responsibility, that money didn't define a person's worth, and now, here he was, part of something that had turned greed into a system. Caleb went on, his tone steady, controlled, but the anger beneath it was clear. The Langfords have been operating for at least 6 years. They target families with assets over $50 million. They identify potential heirs who are impatient or in debt, then offer them a solution, compassionate inheritance. It's all packaged as a dignified transition. They even have psychologists on retainer to justify the claims of dementia. Frank exhaled slowly. "So this isn't just a scam, it's a factory." "Exactly," Caleb said. "A factory that kills the elderly and launders their deaths through paperwork." No one spoke after that. I sat there staring at the name Langford written in the center of the web, feeling a slow, heavy anger build in my chest. It wasn't just about me anymore. My so-called accident wasn't an isolated act of betrayal. It was part of an operation that had been running for years, killing people like me and calling it mercy. I looked up at Caleb. How many of them fought back? He hesitated before answering. A few tried. One woman in Connecticut suspected her son was manipulating her medical records. She died in a fire before she could file a report. Another man in New York transferred his estate to a charity at the last minute. Car accident 2 days later. None of them left enough evidence to connect it back to Langford. I nodded slowly, my throat tight. So the only reason I'm still here is because they think I'm gone. That's right, Caleb said. You're the first one who survived. For a moment I couldn't speak. I felt both sick and strangely calm. The truth settled inside me like a stone, heavy, final, undeniable. Frank looked at me and said quietly, "You realize what that means, right? You're not just fighting for yourself anymore." I met his eyes. I know. Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat at the small desk in my room and opened my notebook. The lamp cast a weak light over the pages. I could still hear the ocean outside, steady and endless. I wrote for a long time, my handwriting uneven from the tremor in my hands. I wrote down everything Caleb had told me, the names, the patterns, the number 23. Then, under it, I wrote a single line. They call it humane. I call it murder. The words didn't make me feel better, but they made things clear. For months, they had written a story about me, the frail woman, the confused widow, the tragic accident. Now, it was my turn to write theirs. It was time to stop hiding. Caleb had warned me that once I stepped into the open, there would be no going back, but I couldn't stay invisible while that baby lived in a house built on lies. So, one morning, I asked Frank to drive me to the edge of the old neighborhood. I walked the rest of the way alone, wearing a hat low over my face, my heart steady for the first time in weeks. The woman who opened the door was younger than I expected, mid-30s, tired eyes, and the kind of calm that comes from working too many long nights. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," I said quietly. "My name is Evelyn Hartman, and I'm not dead." For a second, she didn't understand. Then the color drained from her face. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I saw the news. They said a lot of things." I interrupted gently. "None of them true." Her name was Emily Graves, the nurse hired to care for Noah. She was kind, cautious, the kind of person who followed rules because it was safer than asking questions. When I told her about Lily Harper, the real mother, I saw her composure crack. I showed her the hospital records, the fake birth certificate, the medical note signed by Victoria Langford. Emily covered her mouth with her hand. "They told me he was their baby," she said, her voice shaking. "They said the mother didn't survive the delivery, but that it was all handled legally." I nodded. "They lied to you, just like they lied to everyone else." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh my God, that girl, 17. She didn't deserve this." "No," I said quietly. "She didn't. And neither does that child. He deserves to know where he came from. He deserves the truth." After that, Emily didn't hesitate. She agreed to help us, to let Caleb and Frank install small cameras and recording devices throughout the house while she took Noah out for a walk each afternoon. The setup took 2 days. Cameras in the living room, the study, even the nursery. Caleb made sure everything was hidden well, wired to a secure line. When it was done, we waited. Andrew and Lauren had a meeting with the Langfords that morning, finalizing what Caleb believed were the last documents transferring full ownership of the estate. That was when I wrote the letter. I took my time, using the same stationery I used for family notes years ago, and wrote in my own hand. The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Love, Mom. Caleb delivered it himself to Langford's office while they were inside. He told me later he watched them read it. Andrew went white. Lauren nearly dropped her phone. They left the building in a panic. By the time they returned home, everything was ready. The cameras were live, the recordings were running, and I was sitting in my old chair by the window, the one Richard had bought for me when we first moved into the house. Noah was in my arms, asleep, his tiny hand gripping the edge of my sweater. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the sound of the front door unlocking. Lauren walked in first. When she saw me, she froze, her mouth open but no sound coming out. The color drained from her face, then she screamed, a short, sharp sound that broke into silence. Andrew was behind her. He stopped in the doorway, staring at me like I was a ghost. His eyes darted to the baby, then back to my face. I smiled, calm and steady, the way I used to when he came home late from school. "Hello, my darlings," I said softly. "I'm home." For a moment, no one spoke. The air inside the house was heavy and still, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. Andrew stood frozen in the doorway, his keys still in his hand, while Lauren's scream echoed faintly through the hall before cutting off into silence. I didn't move. I sat in my chair, holding Noah, watching them. I could see the panic flicker behind their eyes as their brains tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The mother they thought they'd buried, sitting in her old living room, alive, calm, and waiting. Lauren was the first to find her voice. "This is insane," she said, her tone sharp but trembling underneath. "You're not supposed to be here. You're dead?" I finished for her. "Yes, I heard that too." I set Noah gently into his bassinet beside the chair and reached for the small recorder on the table. But it seems reports of my death were premature. Andrew took a step forward. "Mom, we can explain." "I'm sure you can," I said, pressing the record button, "but I think I'll start." The red light blinked on. My voice was steady, deliberate. "My name is Evelyn Hartman. I am 67 years old, and I was pushed off my own yacht by my son and his wife. They did it to steal my company, my estate, and my life. Everything they've said about me, every claim about my mind, my memory of how it was a lie, built by them with the help of Victoria Langford and her firm, Langford and Gray." Lauren laughed suddenly, sharp and desperate. "You sound unwell, Evelyn. Maybe you should sit down before you hurt yourself." "I'm already sitting," I said evenly, "and I'm not the one who's about to get hurt." I stood up slowly, walked to the coffee table, and opened the folder I'd brought with me. Inside were printed photos, copies of every file I'd taken from the study, every video, every forged signature. "You built this," I said, holding up the documents. "Every lie, every piece of fake evidence, and you recorded it all. The only mistake you made was doing it in this house." Lauren's face went pale. "No one will believe you," she said quickly. "You're a sick old woman with an imagination and a grudge." I looked at her for a long time, then pointed toward the corner of the room, where a small light blinked faintly. "You're right, Lauren. No one would believe me, but they might believe the cameras you didn't know were there." Her mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, she had no answer. Andrew turned toward the wall, staring at the small blinking lights, one, then another, realizing what they were. "You bugged the house," he whispered. "No," I said quietly. "Caleb did." And right on cue, a car door slammed outside. More footsteps. The front door opened again, and Victoria Langford walked in as if she owned the place. She was dressed perfectly, her hair neat, her voice smooth. "What's going on here?" she said, scanning the room, her eyes landing on me. "Mrs. Hartman? My. This is quite the surprise." "Not for long," I said. Before she could answer, another set of footsteps followed hers. Heavier, faster. Voices shouted, "FBI, hands where we can see them." Victoria froze. The color drained from her face as two agents stepped into the living room, weapons drawn but calm. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a badge around her neck, spoke clearly. "Victoria Langford, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, financial coercion, and attempted murder." Victoria's composure cracked for the first time. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Agent Chen, that was her name, replied evenly, "Yes, ma'am, we do. We've been dealing with you for 2 years. She nodded toward me. "And Mrs. Hartman just gave us what we needed." Lauren stumbled back, her face white. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Andrew just stood there, staring at the floor, his hands shaking. As the agents cuffed Victoria, she turned toward me. "You think this ends with me?" she said coldly. "You think exposing one woman will change anything?" "No," I said softly, "but it's a start." They let her out. The house was silent again except for Noah's soft breathing from the bassinet. Andrew sank onto the couch, his shoulders slumped, his face blank. For the first time in his life, he looked small. He looked at me and whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry." I watched him for a long time before answering, "No, Andrew, you're sorry because you got caught, not because you were wrong." His eyes filled with tears, but I didn't look away. "You let someone convince you that money mattered more than blood. And now you get to live with that." Lauren had backed herself into the corner, shaking her head, muttering under her breath. "You ruined everything. she said. You were supposed to be gone. You were supposed to be gone. I turned away from her. There was nothing left to say. I went back to the chair, picked up Noah, and held him close. He stirred a little, then went still again, his head resting against my shoulder, his small heartbeat pressed against mine, the sound of something pure in the middle of so much destruction. Outside, I could hear the agents' cars pulling away, the faint echo of sirens fading down the street. The lights in the house flickered as one of the agents disconnected the power to the recording devices. For the first time in a long time, the silence felt real. Andrew sat with his head in his hands, Lauren sobbing quietly beside him. I didn't speak again. There was nothing left to say. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, that old familiar sound, Noah began to cry. His small voice filled the space that used to be my home, and for a moment I let it wash over me. It wasn't a sound of grief, it was a reminder that everything they had built on lies was ending, and something else, something honest, was finally beginning. It's been 5 years. I'm 72 now, and I live in a small house on a hill overlooking the vineyard Richard planted half a century ago. The land is quiet, the air smells of earth and grapes, and when the sun sets, the whole valley glows gold. It's not the house I once called home, but it's mine, and that's enough. Noah is 5 now, all legs and laughter running between the vines like the world belongs to him. He calls me Grandma, and every time I hear it, it still catches in my chest. This morning, he stopped beside me holding a bunch of green grapes in his small hand. Grandma, he said, his voice bright and curious, do I look like my mom Lily? I crouched down, brushed the hair from his forehead, and looked into those big brown eyes, the same eyes that belonged to a girl who never got to see her son grow up. You do, I told him softly. Especially the eyes. They're the kind that trust people, even when they shouldn't. He smiled, satisfied with the answer, and ran off again, the sound of his laughter carrying through the vineyard. I watched him for a long time, feeling something between joy and grief. Frank still goes out to sea. He says the ocean keeps him honest. He's Noah's godfather now, though Noah calls him Captain Frank, and believes he lives on his boat. Every Sunday, Frank brings him shells and old stories about the sea, and every Sunday night, Noah tells them back to me as if they were his own adventures. Nora reopened the inn, but she also opened something new, a cafe in town called Second Chance. It's small, cozy, filled with plants and books, the kind of place where people come to start over. She keeps a picture of Lily on the counter beside the cash register. She says it reminds her why she does what she does. Caleb still visits sometimes. He never stays long, but he always brings a file or two. New names, new families, new, compassionate inheritance cases waiting to be investigated. The Langfords are gone now, locked away for life, but others have tried to pick up where they left off. Every time he brings me something, I pass it along to the authorities quietly, through the same network that once helped me stay alive. We call it the Harper Foundation now, named after Lily. It helps young women who've been tricked or trapped in surrogacy schemes, the ones who don't have anyone to speak for them. It started small, with just a few volunteers, but it's grown. We've already helped dozens of women rebuild their lives. Sometimes, when I walk through the office, I hear laughter, real laughter, and it feels like the kind of justice I can believe in. People sometimes ask me why I do it, why I keep fighting when I could just enjoy my peace. I always tell them the same thing. Because I know what it feels like to be erased by someone you love. The truth is, survival changes you. It makes you see time differently, not as something that passes, but as something you earn. Tonight, after Noah goes to sleep, I sit at my desk with my old notebook. The pages are worn, the ink faded in places, but it's still the same one I started 5 years ago, the Second Life Project. I write slowly, my hands not as steady as they used to be, but the words come easier now. I write. If anyone ever finds this, don't let someone else write your obituary while you're still breathing. Write your own story. Rewrite it if you have to. Outside, the last of the sunlight spills across the vines, painting the leaves in shades of amber and gold. The house is quiet except for the faint sound of Noah's breathing from the next room. I close the notebook and look out the window, letting the silence settle. In another life, I might have wanted revenge, but now I understand something different. Justice isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about living long enough to tell the truth. And as the light fades from the sky, I whisper to myself, not in anger, not in grief, but in peace. I lived long enough to tell mine.